Welcome to this edition of Metro West Coders. Again, we are especially delighted to have an award-winning and very talented speaker, Mr. Brian Tarbox. Brian is an Amazon Certified Solutions Architect Associate and a master of many programming skills. He'd like to share his experiences from Amazon reInvent. So please take it away, Brian.
Thank you, Morgan. As always, you're very kind. So let's see. Okay. So just want to go over what we'll be covering, and hopefully you're all seeing the overview agenda slide. I'm going to talk about the scale, both of the show itself and of Amazon Web Services. Then talk about some themes that I've observed, and also that some other people have observed, or we believe we are observing, coming out of the show, and then a description of the new services. Going into the show, Amazon already had something like 50 services, and they added a whole fleet of new services. So there's the topic is getting larger and larger. One of the things that I mentioned to Morgan earlier is Amazon certifications only last 2 years, as it turns out, because it's growing so quickly that you have to get recertified every 2 years. I generally haven't been a huge fan of certifications, but the Amazon certification test was bloody hard enough that I actually quite like it. If you do go for the certification, study, because it's hard. But anyway, so I went to this. This is actually only the fourth reInvent. I went to the second one when it was a whopping 6,000 people. Last year was 13,000, and this year is 25,000. So it's a roughly doubling every year, which is a pretty crazy pace. There have been some talk that there were actually only 19,000 attendees, but we're pretty sure there were 25,000 because everybody downloaded an app to get the schedule and get around, and Amazon had actually a very clever idea that they put a social game on the app where you would scan each other's badges, and the more badges you scanned, the more points you got. And no one really knew what the prizes were, but in the end, it was really just an ice-breaking device, so you could go up to people you didn't know, and have something to say to get a conversation started. You can imagine, even in a large conference center with 25,000 people, you're bumping into a lot of folks you don't know. So icebreakers are pretty good. So the show itself was crazy big. You can imagine it was on 5 floors of a conference center, but even with that, 25,000 people at the end of the 11 o'clock seminar, 25,000 people trying to get down the 2 escalator banks to the food hall was kind of a madhouse, a little bit terrifying to see so many people all pushed together. And how they managed to feed 25,000 people in 60 minutes is kind of beyond me. But anyway, so the show was very, very large. Lots of sessions, lots of good parties. Of course, Amazon likes to throw a big party. Now the services themselves, Amazon asserts, and I haven't heard anyone dispute this, that they've got 14 times the installed base of all the other cloud providers combined. So, and they're going up against folks like Microsoft and Google. So that's no mean feat to have taken such a huge share of the market with tons and tons of services. One of the things that actually really struck me about the show was that there was very little negative feedback about the outages. If you've been using Amazon recently, you'll have noticed probably that in the couple weeks before the show, there were 2 pretty significant outages. There was an East Coast outage on a Sunday that lasted about 9 hours, followed by a partial outage on the East Coast on a Tuesday that lasted 3 or 4 hours. And I had actually expected that there would be all kinds of mea culpas, all kinds of apologies, all kinds of discussions about this outage, and there really wasn't. Now, there was a spin by Amazon, but even a lot of the Amazon customers seemed to accept the spin, which was the outage was confined to the East Coast region. And one of the things that cloud providers tell us is that you should be multi-region because you should anticipate that things break. And even during the outage, when following the Twitter comments, people were saying things like, "Well, you can tell who's done HA correctly because they're multi-region, and all their services just failed over to the West Coast and kept on running." So
that's interesting.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny if you've heard of something called Chaos Monkey. Netflix has a set of systems where they, on purpose, break parts of their production environment on the real production environment to make sure that it automatically fails over. And this is called the Chaos Monkey. Well, Chaos Monkey is one of the services. It makes up what they call the Simian Army. And so they just say breakage is part of life and deal with it. And not saying that Amazon's outages were on purpose, but it's certainly a reminder that things break and you have to plan for it. So they've gotten by with pretty much not a lot of penalties for having some outages that were significant. So, and if you're on the East Coast only, you were stuck for a while. But anyway, so that's the scale. That's the scale of things. So jumping ahead to tracks, there's generally three kinds of sessions you can go to at these conferences. They'll devote a lot of the keynotes to talking about the new services, to introducing them, and then in the deeper sessions you can go to tracks that discuss those services. You can go to deeper dives explaining how to use the existing services and tips and tricks and things you might not know about using those. Those tend to be the upper level classes. And then there are also intermixed case studies with how various companies have actually used the services. And those can be quite interesting, although I'll say they can also be a little too specific about the particular companies. I mean, it's interesting to see how a company is using a system, but depending on how different that company is from what you're doing, it may seem a little too specific. So, I mean, they're interesting, but I do tend to stay away from those. But these are the general categories of things you see at the conference.
That's a good slide, Brian. What track do you find yourself most?
Well, I like to go into the deep dives because the new services, just because they're new, I sort of need to wrap my head around them. The deeper dives are wonderful because they're typically given by the technical leads and development leads of the particular service. So you can ask sort of the down and dirty questions of how does this actually work. Now one drawback to the conference being this large was that there really wasn't time for Q&A. They expanded the time between sessions to half an hour, but moving 25,000 people around, every 90 minutes meant that they didn't have a lot of Q&A time. So that was actually a bit of a disappointment. But the best you can do is at the end of a talk, if it's an interesting one, you run up and get a business card and from the speaker, and then ask questions. And I've done that, and that's actually really, really nice because then you have a contact and you can have an ongoing dialogue. And they also will tend to give hints on directions that the services are going in. So, I mean, on the other hand, I also intermixed it with things that I didn't, I'll go to talks on things I don't know anything about just to learn. So it's a bit of a mix. So this is the one sort of marketing-ish slide. It's interesting, but there'll only be just the one. Gartner does this magic quadrant to show where the various cloud providers are, and you want to be in the upper right. And you can see, Amazon is pretty far ahead of everybody else. HP isn't even on here, which is just as well since they've exited the arena. But Microsoft is the only ones up in the upper quadrant with Amazon, but even there, they're significantly far behind. But catching up, and Amazon always makes a point of speaking well of Microsoft. So anyway, the one and only marketing-ish slide. So now I can say I've carried my water for them. So these were sort of the themes that I saw in the show. The first two kind of go together. They want to make the things that were, if not impossible, pretty damn hard possible, and then make the things that already were possible but maybe painful easy. And so the examples I can give for those two are, suppose you wanted to move petabytes of data into the cloud, and there are companies that really want to do that. Even with high-speed connections, moving a petabyte of data across, an internet connection is pretty painfully slow. They have had a service called Direct Connect where you can ship them hard drives, because as they say, never underestimate the throughput of a FedEx van. But there's a lot of problems with that. Notably security, and just moving all these drives around and then getting them back and making sure that your data is not lost someplace. So they introduced something called a Snowbird, which is basically a suitcase, a ruggedized suitcase holding 100 terabyte drives or larger that you can ship back and forth to Amazon to basically send a suitcase full of disk drives over and get those petabytes of data installed quickly. So it's taking something that was impossibly slow and making it doable. On making the possible easy, we'll talk later about spot instances. Spot instances are a way to reserve computers in the Amazon cloud at a very low cost, because you're basically bidding on their excess capacity. And it's a real great way to save money if you can handle occasional outages, but it can be complicated to know how to bid, how much to bid, what the pricing trends have been that you're trying to guess against. And so now I'm a big fan of spot instances, but it is kind of a bit of an art to guessing how to do the bidding. So they added something called the spot pricing console that makes it incredibly easy. So basically trying to take the pain away from using one of their key features. They also continue to flesh out the services that they already have. It's hard to truth check this, but they asserted in one of their keynotes that this year they've added 500 or so features or featurettes to their existing services. You do continue to see services that started out as fairly basic getting expanded. An example is CloudWatch, Cloud Trails. These names they're beginning to run out of cute names. Cloud Trails is a system that produces an audit trail of all the API calls made against your system, and you can imagine it generates all the API calls against your entire account. You can generate hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of these records a day, and there wasn't any way to filter them. So a lot of us just learned to write log scraping scripts. Well, that was great as a 1.0 feature, but now they've added more sophisticated query capabilities, so they've made things easier. And they just keep rolling out lots and lots of little features like that. The other thing they do is to take existing services and make them work well together. My own take on it is that each of the Amazon services by themselves are pretty cool, but you get the real multiplier effect when you put the services together. So one of the themes this year was a service called Lambda, and we'll talk about that later. And Lambda by itself is very cool, but they also now integrate Lambda with a bunch of their other features, in particular application gateway. And so as you begin to be able to stitch all these services together, true, you get more lock-in, but you also get the multiplier effect of services working well together. And the last thing is some of their services originally are only available in certain regions, and that's either because they haven't rolled out the equipment to do this, or they're testing to see whether. Sorry. Sorry.
I think we just have a new user joining us. Welcome.
Excellent. Okay, I think we've got a reverb. Okay then. Okay, excellent. No more reverb. So Amazon has been announced that more of their services that were just in one region are now available in other regions, and that's something you'll continue to see them doing. This last line is by Jeffrey Snover, a guy I used to work for at Tivoli. He's now gone off to become a fellow at Microsoft, and he's the inventor of PowerShell. So he's one of the brightest guys you're going to run into. And I remember years ago he said, Brian, the first 2 million lines are table stakes. And what he meant by that was that there's a bunch of code you have to write for your application to get it to the basic things: put up the splash screen, log in, have notifications, store and retrieve data, things that all applications do that don't distinguish your application at all. They're not your business logic. They're what you have to ante-up even just to have an application. And he said you have to do that, but it doesn't do you any good in distinguishing yourself from anybody else. And so what Amazon's play with the whole Amazon Cloud Services is that they provide the table stakes. They provide all these services that you can pick and choose to use, so that you can then concentrate on doing whatever your particular application niche is. And I think at this point it's well more than 2 million lines. But Snover is a smart guy, and so I think he saw this coming even a decade ago. So those are some themes that I saw in the show. And then some spotlights of things in particular. Machine learning is getting to be a very big deal. And I went to one talk that really crystallized for me a way that machine learning can be used that I hadn't really anticipated. I mean, I think a lot of us have seen the various cloud providers offering machine learning, and I don't know about you, but I've sort of wondered, why would I ever possibly use that? Well, there was a great talk given by a company that used machine learning and other Amazon services to understand the Twitter stream that referenced their company. So if you think about it, if you've got a big company and people are posting tweets about your company, some of them are just chatting about the company, some are saying, oh, what a great service you have. Some of them are reporting bugs, and some of them are annoyed customers who need some hand-holding. And if you're smart, you want to take advantage of that information and enter bugs and get, support people, talking to people who are having real problems. But the Twitter stream can be so large that you might have to have a fleet of people reading the Twitter stream to find which messages really were a problem. So in the course of a 40-minute talk, this one speaker described a system where they took a sample, 1,000 or so tweets, used an Amazon service called Mechanical Turk, which lets you farm work out to actual people, and they essentially rented people out to hand filter these 1,000 tweets, and from that they built up a learning system that could recognize what sort of tweets meant what sort of things. They passed that through this machine learning system to do categorization. They then attached that to the Twitter stream for their actual company, and based on how the machine learning system categorized each tweet, they would either ignore the tweet or send an SMS message to their support team. And it's using a lot of Amazon tools, and they did provide the links to how to get all the code. But imagine being able to just hook up a system that automatically scaled to parse out all the tweets into the things you cared about and things you didn't. So
that's amazing. Can you share? Do you remember the name of the company that did that?
I think. Well, no, but tell you what. As a note that I'll do either tonight or tomorrow, I'll put a comment on the meetup for a link to that talk.
That's really interesting. I know there's a local company that's very interested in parsing tweet data in the fashion that you described. Very, very, very interesting stuff on the horizon here, or I guess in the present.
Right. Well, the other thing you might that I sort of wonder about is log analysis. Imagine every time we find a bug, we've probably done some log scraping, and wouldn't it be great if the next time that sort of bug came around, this machine learning system, looked at the logs for us and said, "Oh, that's probably such and such a kind of problem." I mean, that could be game changing. So I don't know. I mean, I think they kept talking about machine learning over and over again. Machine learning and lambdas were, just about every other talk made a reference to it. So I think those are going to be big. So with that as a lame segue, lambda. Lambdas were probably the most talked about piece at this show. If you don't know lambdas, basically when you want to run in the cloud prior to Lambda, you rented an EC2 computer and you put some code on it and you ran the code, or you spun up a website using CloudFront. Or something like that. But basically, you spun up services in computers and then waited for inputs to happen. And you could use auto-scaling to turn things up or down, but in Amazon, you're still charged by the hour for computers. So if you spin a computer up and it handles one request, and at the end of the hour you spin it down, you still paid for the hour. In the world of lambdas, you write functions, and you place these functions up in the web services, and you say which events should trigger the function. And so a typical example is, suppose you wanted to create a thumbnail of an image anytime someone put an image file on your S3 bucket. Well, what you'd do with Lambda is you'd write a little function that would create the thumbnail, and you would have it be triggered by the new file event. And so and that's all you do. you wouldn't provision anything. You just write the code and let it sit there. And then when someone created a new file on in S3, your Lambda would get triggered, it would run, and then it would be done. And you wouldn't have to provision a thing. And EC2 computers, you get charged by the hour. Lambda, you get charged by the 100 milliseconds of compute time. And because we're Amazon scale, your first 1,000,000 invocations a month are free. So you might never pay for anything if you don't get 1,000,000 invocations a month. So Lambda was a big deal, and oh yeah, Docker. I remember when Docker was a big deal. Last year, Docker was a big deal, and outside of Amazon, Docker is still a big deal, but in the cloud, it's much less, at least in Amazon's cloud, it's a much smaller big deal. So the, we used to talk about the standard 3-tier web architecture of, your web server, your business logic, and then your storage layer as the standard 3 tiers. But it feels like Amazon is pushing a new type of architecture where you have an application gateway, which is basically some code that you configure that says, when I get these these REST calls made at this address, call these functions. And so you're making, a gateway just by configuration. And then, oh, by the way, the things that it calls could just be Lambda functions. And then the Lambda functions might invoke some machine learning or analytics, and you might store your result in, a SQL or non-SQL, Dynamo, MapReduce S3 persistence layer. So it's sort of a different way of thinking of the application tiers. And if you look at these four, you don't have to provision anything. So one of the lines they kept saying was, no server is easier to manage than no server. So
that's a good line.
Yeah, they're really pushing that, and it's very compelling. And Morgan and I have been chatting about this back and forth over the last year or so. And a year ago, I said, Morgan, in 5 years we might look back and say, gosh, remember when we needed computers? So I'm 1 year into my 5-year prediction, so we'll see. But it's an interesting notion to not provision computers. So anyway, so those are the big themes I saw. So the next thing I want to talk about was the new services, and there's so many new services that you have to break them up into categories. And since Amazon now has 65 services, I spend a lot of time on this, but I can't know all of it. So some of these I can tell you in detail, and some of them I'm going to wave my hands a little bit, just because I haven't played with them or because they're just so brand new. So Amazon Internet of Things. This is something brand new, and it's we'll see whether this is a big deal or not. But this does seem to be the age of the Internet of Things, where you have all kinds of little devices out there gathering data. I mean, how many Raspberry Pis are there out gathering some kind of data? How many intelligent doorknobs and intelligent light bulbs and thermostats are there? To say nothing of how many hundreds of thousands of little ocean sensors are floating around. And all of these little devices are typically gathering data and sending the data back someplace. But it's a different model than a generally connected device. These ocean sensors might only talk back to the home office once a day. You know, so Internet of Things is basically a system for collecting and gathering up the information from all these remote sensors. And one of the things they're doing is providing something called shadow devices that let you deal with your whole constellation of devices, even if most of them are offline at any given time. So there's the URL I put there is actually a really good summary of what they're doing, but and then in the highlighted text, it's basically you can configure all these devices to send information to the internet gateway, and then you can trigger rules for what should happen with the data, and when conditions are met. And not surprisingly, what will you probably fire off when the conditions are met? You'll probably fire off a Lambda, because you don't want to, you don't need to be provisioning for, conditions that may or may not be met at any given time. So, Internet of Things, it's a nascent service, but it might become really big. I mean, might not, but it looks pretty interesting. QuickSight. It's and I'll say right off the top, I'm not a business visualization, business intelligence visualization person. So this is one of these ones where I'm going to wave my hands a bit. But they were very happy with their new acronym SPICE, and the idea is that you can gather all. We're basically drowning in data. And any way you can slice and dice and parse the data and get visualizations, the better. And so QuickSight is their answer to that. And in the examples they gave, it did seem like they were parsing pretty enormous amounts of data, in seconds in real time on the screen. But I leave it to the BI specialists to find out whether this is actually something pretty cool or not. Firehose. So Kinesis is their system for gathering real-time data and taking that real-time data and sticking it either in flat files in S3 or into Redshift, where you can do SQL-like analysis. And Kinesis Firehose is basically a system for gathering higher capacity streaming data. Again, with the theme that there are lots and lots of data sources out there, and there's so much data that the trick is really to figure out how to pull in all that data, do some pre-processing on it, so that then you can do some later analysis. And this is just another managed service that comes with auto-scaling, so you turn on Kinesis, and then Kinesis scales up or down depending on the volume of data that's being sprayed at it. And they have Kinesis Analytics coming soon. It's not quite there, but again, if Amazon convinces you to stick your data into Kinesis, then they can hook you further by giving you cool analytics and then QuickSight analysis. So, at a certain level, all of this is vendor lock-in, but it's vendor lock-in that benefits you as well because you're providing these cool services, or at least that's the party line. And then extended retention. Firehose data is meant to be transient. If you're pulling in millions of records a second, the records from a few hours ago are probably much less interesting because you're being swamped by the new records, but they are extending the amount of time you can hang on to it. And the Kinesis people seem very excited by this. I'll be honest, I don't quite get that, but I'm not a Kinesis specialist. And this one was very sad.
Well, imagine if those gazillion things coming in are mouse clicks or scroll bar moves or things that could be used by a machine intelligence that could tell somebody how their website's getting used. You could see that data as very ephemeral and fire hosey, but the analytics that a machine intelligence could do on that might make the difference between being able to have a good website or a bad website in terms of making a sale, you know?
Absolutely, absolutely. I'm trying to understand the scenario where you process everything in soft real time, but then might still want to go back, up to 24 hours later and look at the raw data. I'm sure there are cases of it. I just don't know what they are.
Yep. Yep.
Okay. Um, Elasticsearch as a service is very sad. There was a company at the trade show that had a booth saying that they provided Elasticsearch hosting, and then in the keynote on the first day, Amazon announces that they're providing Elasticsearch as a managed service. So the company put a brave face on it, but and maybe they have maybe they're providing some extra value, but it did seem like they got skunked. And that's, development is a full contact sport, and sometimes the big boys take your business plan and decide that they want it. I mean, for myself, I do manage Elasticsearch, and if Amazon wants to manage it for me, more power to them. It's just another basic service that I don't have to worry about. So, but it's sad for that other company. Database migration, again, with the possibility of lock-in. I mean, Amazon wants you to use their database services, and they want to lower the barriers to entry to let you do that. So if you want to migrate from one version of Oracle to another, or from Oracle to MySQL, or to Postgres or Aurora, it's obviously in Amazon's interest to make that easier. So they have a schema conversion, which is cool, but not so crazy hard. But they assert that they also can convert views, triggers, and stored procedures. Now I've gone through. I mean, at Broadbus, where Morgan and I were working, we went through a transition from Oracle to Oracle stored procedures to MySQL stored procedures. That ain't easy. So if they've managed to figure out how to do that, well, yay for them.
I wonder if they. I'm just guessing, but I wonder if they have their own proprietary SQL variant and they just convert everything into and out of that, or they have some kind of an abstract syntax tree for stored procedures, some kind of lingua franca or some kind of proprietary lingua franca that they use. I don't know how. It's interesting how they could do that.
Well, that makes sense. In a million years, they're never going to tell you, but but it does make sense. And they did say that in places where they couldn't complete it, they would essentially put change bars and make it easy for you to pick out the parts that they didn't convert. And they did convert from at the keynote. They converted from from MySQL to Postgres or something, and it seemed to do a pretty credible job. The other thing along these lines are RDS is their relational data service, where it's basically SQL data as a service, and they've added they currently support MySQL and Postgres and a couple others. Something's probably right in front of me. I just don't remember. And they now added MariaDB, which is sort of an interesting one. Mariah is the open source database by the folks who made MySQL. And so if you're afraid that MySQL is going to get Oracleized, and you should be, it's already happening, then MariaDB might be an interesting choice. And you pick the database, pick whatever database you want. There are still lots of people running Oracle and paying big bucks for that. But if you can move to a lower cost database that has all the capabilities you need, obviously why not? Okay. Snowball. Snowball was that suitcase full of terabytes of data. It's kind of an interesting thing to showcase. They took this suitcase full of all this data, and they did a drop test of dropping it 6 feet onto a concrete floor, and it came away with no damage. That was an expensive damn test, I'd say, because they probably didn't get it right the first time. But the thing that struck me as so cute from an Amazon point of view is that the Snowball suitcase has a Kindle built in for the smart shipping label. So basically you call up Amazon and say, I have X terabytes or petabytes of data I want to send to you. They send you, one or more of these Snowball devices. The Kindle shipping label automatically adjusts. It's tamper resistant and tamper evident with built-in security keys. And you load your data up, ship it back to Amazon, and you can rest easy that your data is secure, or so the theory goes. And it gets loaded into the cloud pretty quickly. From there you do whatever you want to do. So just thought it was interesting that a big white suitcase was one of their top hits. But so be it. So okay, another, and you can see that this is just, it feels like sort of an endless series of new services, and some of these services will be big, and some may not be, but you get the sense that there's a lot of them. So application firewall, this would be in the category of things that you could do yourself. If you have a web application that's in the cloud, hopefully you already do have some kind of firewall in place. It's just it's one of these common infrastructure-y things that Amazon decided they could do some of the undifferentiated heavy lifting for you, and so they have this firewall that can filter web traffic for you with whitelists and blacklists. They can look for patterns of access that you don't want to allow. They give you a very good monitoring of all that. And again, it's you certainly could roll this yourself, but that's protecting your application against the bad guys probably isn't the point of your app. You probably want to put your energy doing whatever your app is supposed to do, rather than spend time protecting it from the bad guys. So again, if you buy into this whole theory, and you can buy into this whole theory of managed services or not, but if you do buy into it, here's another bit of the infrastructure that you don't have to write. Inspector. This is security is always a big topic in the cloud, and I'll say that in the past I was a developer and DevOps for an Amazon system that was running financial data for the large brokerages, and so we were under intense scrutiny for our security practices. We were subject to all kinds of audits. It's necessary, but it's very painful. And Inspector basically automates the process of seeing if you're doing it right. There are a lot of known things that one can do badly, ranging from not rotating your passwords to having guessable passwords to having, disks that aren't encrypted at rest. And so there's, a whole laundry list of things generally not to do. You have locked up all your ports on your systems, haven't you? And so Amazon Inspector goes and automates the process of scanning for these known problems. It's probably highly recommended. It'll probably in the end, saves you time by running this. Spots. Now, here's a topic that didn't even get a lot of attention because they made a bunch of these announcements right before the show, but spots are one of my favorite features of Amazon, where, instead of saying I want to buy, I want to rent a computer for an hour for a particular price, you're basically, with spots, bidding on the excess capacity. And you really have to have a sense of how much capacity is in Amazon. One of their guys came out to Boston about 3 years ago now and said that if you imagine all the compute resources that Amazon, the retail company, had back when they were a little $5 billion company, that amount of compute resources is what Amazon Web Services adds every day to their system. So it's at a scale that's almost unimaginable. I've tried for years to get a tour of one of the data centers, and even the internal engineers can't get that. It's sort of staggering. So at that level of scale, there's always some percentage of the system that's not currently in use, and Spot lets you bid on that unused capacity. And so you say, I want to rent such and such a computer, and I'm willing to bid up to 0.7 of a penny an hour, for example. And very often the price is below that, and you get the system for 10% of the price that you'd pay if you bought it as an on-demand instance. Now you run the risk that the price could fluctuate and go up, and then your instance does go away. And so that sort of teaches you at a certain level to do this whole reactive programming thing that we're supposed to be doing these days, of have stateless systems that are failure tolerant and can restart. So at a certain level, I kind of like the fact that spots can occasionally fail, because they make you code for that, but in general, they don't fail. Now, fleets is a way to spin up tens or hundreds or thousands, actually, of spot instances in a way that distributes your pricing and distributes your instance selection such that you're very diversified. One of the things that's interesting with spots is the price of a spot instance depends on the zone you're in and the type of instance. And so, Amazon has all these instance types. So they have, the M3 medium and the R2 large, and so on. But chances are, if your application can run on an M3 medium, it can also run on an M3 large, or on a C2 medium. And so Spot Fleets lets you take advantage of the fact that spots really are a whole bunch of different markets, and you can say, my application could run on any one of these type of instances, and I want 100 of them, and spread it out so that if the M2 medium price suddenly spikes, well, you might lose a couple spots, but your other spots are still fine. So Fleets lets you use the spot market with even more assurance. Spot reservation takes that to a step further and guarantees you a several-hour block where you won't be interrupted, but you do pay a little bit more for that. But it's still generally half the cost of an on-demand instance. They then added this whole Spot console thing so that you have easier access to all this information, and basically the console reduces the complexity. Because I realized as I'm saying all this, dealing with spots sounds like it can be complex, and before Spot console, it was. But with Spot console, they've again taken something that's doable and made it easier.
Well, what strikes me about this is,
Sure.
remember Enron
Yep.
and they have all these trading for bandwidth.
Yep.
It's almost like we have some non-evil people, um, and now we're not trading for bandwidth, we're trading for CPU cycles. I think you were muted, Brian. Yep. Brian is muted. How do we unmute Brian?
Am I back?
You're back now. Perfect.
Okay.
Hey, I think I found a picture of the snowball.
Okay.
Is that it?
Yes, that's it.
That's such a great idea to put a Kindle in that little window.
Right.
That's great.
Yeah, and it automatically updates because it knows where its location is.
Oh, sure. Well, you'd want a GPS in there, wouldn't you?
Right.
All that data.
Yes.
Sorry, I just saw that and I had to share it. I'll turn it back over to you.
That's excellent. That's excellent. Okay. Do I have the screen again?
We're seeing your face. You need to share to
Okay.
get back to the slide deck.
Okay. Back to here. Spot options.
Spot options. You are good to go.
Okay. Okay. Yeah. So I mean, just think about it. I mean, if Amazon is adding, 10,000 computers a day, which they might be, there's got to be, some excess capacity, and so, they can't sell. I mean, just like you can't run your Linux computer at, your disk at 100%, you have to leave some room. They have to leave some room for customers who want to buy, high-priced options and pay full price. But until they do, why not make some extra money off of the unused capacity? And one of the other things you see is that as they're adding new instance types, the older instance types, are still there. They perhaps can't charge as much for them, but they're still there. But lots of us can make use of them for our low power usage. So everyone should be running spots. Although if they did, there'd be more competition. So nobody runs spots. I want them. So here's I just said that we added new instance types. Here's a couple of sort of twists on instances. Normally, when you're running in Amazon, you're running, essentially a virtual computer inside a hypervisor, and you're sharing the actual physical computer with other people, maybe a lot of other people. And in general, that's fine because the hypervisor keeps everybody isolated. But there may be times when you really wish that you were the only one running on the computer. Maybe for even extra security, maybe for reasons that you don't want to have even the possibility of noisy neighbors, or licensing issues. Suppose you had some very expensive piece of software that was security locked to a particular piece of hardware, for the licensing. Well, you can't just have that running on any old virtualized system. It might actually need to be legally tied to a particular piece of hardware. So you're allowed to say, I want an actual physical computer to run my virtual computers on, and they give the option to do that. It's kind of esoteric, but I guess for some people that's incredibly necessary, and so they give you that option. At the same time, they've also increased the bounds of how big and how small they make virtual computers. So the X1 instance types, and that's not a typo, that's 2 terabytes of physical memory and 100 CPU cores. That is a beast of a machine. And Morgan and Paul will remember back at Broadbus, we made the B1, the B1 that had, I think, a terabyte of physical memory, and we charged about $1 million for it. And imagine if we could have just made a few clicks on the console and ordered one of those for an hour when we needed it, and then got rid of it when we didn't. Kind of game-changing. I have this vision of someone spinning up Java and giving it, a terabyte of virtual memory, and then wondering why the lights are dimming when the garbage collection cycle happens. But
what I'm imagining is somebody running their entire regression test tool suite on one of these things. They had, maybe I don't even use AWS in production. Maybe I just use it as a developer who needs to run the regression suite and of tests. And normally that would take one machine a week. But if I want to open my checkbook because the contract says I have to be done in a day, I just crank that dial up and I run the whole regression suite in the cloud.
Sure.
I just wonder about that stuff.
Sure. I think it's also anticipated for large database systems. I mean, if you wanted to, and here I'm completely talking with no knowledge, but if you essentially wanted to do something crazy like load the human genome in and sort it, or imagine that was a lot smarter, that last statement, but something along those lines. I mean, you could do a lot of interesting things when you have that much crazy amount of physical memory. I don't know what the pricing is for this, but that's possible. And then on the flip side, going tiny, T2 there already was a T2 small. Now they've made a T2 nano that only has 512 megabytes for times when you want teeny tiny. So just interesting that they're going in sort of all directions at once.
That is interesting. Why would anybody want to go small?
Cheaper.
Ah. Because the hardware can still be big. It's just a virtual machine that's sharing by a hypervisor. So Amazon can probably slice that as finely as they want, you're saying.
Right. So imagine that they have some giant X1 machine, but no one has actually asked for an X1 right then, and they could fill in how many zeros is that? 2,000 of these T2 nanos? 2 million? I'm not sure how many zeros, but you could fit a lot of 512s into 2T.
Yep.
So too many zeros, but yeah. So going in all directions at once. Okay. This is the one bit of love that Docker got. One of the things with Docker is you have all these containers, and you want to be able to reuse other people's containers, and there are Docker registries. Well, Amazon decided to provide their own container registry, and so I guess that's pretty handy. And they the Amazon Container Service didn't used to have a CLI support, and now it does. And that's kind of all they said about Docker. So, it's still there. They still support it. I'm sure there's still development going on with it, but it's been supplanted, at least in mind share, by Lambda. Lambda.
A few of us are old enough to get that reference.
Yeah. So lambdas were originally, you could only write them in Node.js, and then they 6 months ago or so they added support for Java, and for a while there was unclear whether they were supporting just Java or any JVM language, but it's any JVM, so you can write your lambdas in Scala, which is sort of funny. Um, um, you can have a versioning of your lambdas. Scheduled lambdas are interesting in that normally lambdas respond to events, but the question was raised, well, what if my event is some time has elapsed? And so you can now essentially cron your lambdas. And lambdas typically are supposed to run briefly, but they've extended the amount of time that they can run to up to 5 minutes. But a 5-minute compute-bound entity, that's doing a fair chunk of work. So that's kind of handy. And then, as I mentioned earlier, integration with application gateway. So gateway lets you specify your response to REST API calls, and then you can have the response be anything you want. It can be firing off a call to some provisions server that you have, or it can be a Lambda, and that seems much simpler in a certain way. So it's again the tight integration. And this was actually a slide that I pulled out from. I'm still watching the videos of sessions that I didn't get to go to, and this is from a quote from a company that was using lambdas, and this was their lessons learned. And they said, "Yeah, it works as expected, minimal effort. This first one, or this third one, successfully able to focus on the domain-specific part of our problem with minimal ops work. Wouldn't it be nifty to actually focus on the domain part of your problem?"
Table stakes.
Yeah, exactly. These guys were doing video, and they just wanted to do video. They didn't want to bother with the other stuff. And then the point at the bottom really caught my eye. Cost savings appear to be on the order of magnitude. People haven't even been talking about the cost savings of Lambda, but it's enormous. I mean, your Lambda only runs when there's work to do. So your Lambda is at 100% utilization. It's not running when there's no work to do, so you're not being charged when there's no work to do. Even if you have wonderful auto-scaling behind a load balancer, you have to have excess capacity at all times to handle failovers, to handle bursts, just the lag time to scale up and down. You always are running at something less than 100% capacity. I mean, you're probably lucky if you can get above 75% capacity, because you probably should be scaling up. But lambdas handle the load balancing for you, they handle the auto scaling for you, and you're charged by the 100 millisecond increment. So I'm not at all surprised to see an order of magnitude cost reduction. And if you can reduce your cost of goods by an order of magnitude, oh my God! I mean, that's that's game changing. And it just strikes me as so interesting that such a huge aspect of Lambda isn't even described as the cool part of the feature. I think it should be, but anyway. So there we go. This is just another screenshot from one of the talks where they say, on the left here, a bunch of applications producing some data. God knows what it is or why. It's going into Kinesis, Amazon Kinesis streams. You see those shards are things that Kinesis automatically spun up based on the load, and then each of those shards are invoking little lambdas off on the side to do work. And you don't see anything provisioned here. It's just services that are just running and scaling for you. It's a whole different way of looking at computing, I think. Mobile Hub, and we're getting towards the end of the litany of new services, but Mobile Hub is another one of these table stakes things. So think about you have an idea for a new mobile application. Well, you've got to do registration and login and authentication, and you've got to handle notifications. And Mobile Hub basically lets you go to a design palette and say, yes, I want all of those things, notification, login, blah, 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 blah. And by the way, I want it for Android, and push a button and it spits out the source code for you. And then all you have to do is write, it's taken care of the table stakes. You only have to write your bit of the application. Now the flip side, of course, is how are all those services being provided for you? Well, by Amazon, of course. It's not surprising. They want to make their money too. So it is lock-in. I mean, all of this is lock-in, but they've just written the first 2 million lines of code for you. So, maybe it's okay if they make a few bucks too, because they've helped you get your application out the door. But before it gets out the door, you better test it, and you better test it on, at least one of every type of device out there. And of course, your little 1 or 2 person shops has a copy of one of every device that's out there, right? Well, of course not. So you can go to their device farm, and you can test it on every version of Android that's running around there, and all the iOS versions, and all the Windows phones as well. So that's, again, a game-changing thing. Without Device Farm, there's no way you could test on all the devices, and now you can, and it's easy.
Hey Brian, did anybody talk about latency? Because there's some jobs where you can farm it up, but there's some things where, like especially where Taylor and I work, latency is a big issue, especially like when police and fire, when they're talking on their phones, that communications has to happen immediately. We can't send something up to the cloud to be processed, right, and be pushed down later.
Sure. So, well, I'm just trying to think of how to answer that. I mean, so the question is there more latency? I mean, so I think there's an assumption that I mean, are you talking about things like lambdas, or what are you which?
Well, I guess looking at this overall, and I see what they're doing where you're breaking up whatever the work you want to do, your application, you're breaking up in all these little pieces. Well, yeah, a lot of it's up in the cloud, but at some point, I'm not in the cloud, I'm here. So if I have my device or something, at some point, the I/O, at some point, you have to actually do something. Eventually, it has to go to the actual destination, right?
Sure.
I mean, I don't know. I guess.
Sure. Put it this way: I'm not at all suggesting that a policeman's walkie-talkie should be sending its packets up to the cloud.
Because we are actually doing some of that. We're doing some stuff in the cloud, but I'm just wondering. It just reminds me of how things used to be. Oh, just have dumb terminals. We'll batch everything up and we'll process. And then we're like, oh no, don't do that. We're going to do everything now on their own computer. It's like this line keeps shifting back and forth. Now it's don't do any processing locally. Do it on-premise versus in the cloud.
Right. Well, I think it's always balance is a virtue that's often missed. I think the cloud has all kinds of wonderful capabilities, but if you and I are both in a burning building and our walkie-talkies can talk back and forth to each other, I would much prefer that than if they had to rely on some data center someplace.
Right. It's kind of funny. I feel like every time I start working on some technology, it's already obsolete. I've been doing all this salt work with the salt stack, and I've been real excited about it. And I'm looking at this going, all the DevOps, all that's going to go away? Or is it just that whatever the work is, it shifts? It's going to now move to pros and cons. When you do one thing, you're giving up something else, right?
Right.
Well,
Well,
pain point.
right, right. But I guess Paul, because I also do salt, and I'm in a group that identifies as DevOps or DevOps-ish. Uh, you know, uh, do you want to be doing configuration uh, of your application or configuration of the hardware that your application runs on? It's I think DevOps may move up the chain. Maybe there's such a thing as Lambda ops. I'm not sure, but
Yeah.
um,
There's
I
also
mean,
there's configuration managers for doing different things, right? There's deploying. So I'm actually more in the testing area where I'm trying to automate. We have to do all this testing, and there's a whole bunch of you can't automate everything because there's always a cost. But I see, I like to do something once or twice, three times to learn, and once I learn it, I never want to do it again. I have the computer do it, and that's where you get reproducible, repeatable results.
yep, absolutely, absolutely. I'm just saying that some of these things, um, uh, put it this way, on any computer that you're responsible for, you have to worry about, SSH keys to get into the system, and key rotation, and locking down ports, and
No, run
all,
wide open, baby.
right, all of those things. None of those things apply to Lambda. There's no SSHing onto a Lambda. There's no key rotation. It's all Amazon's problem. Now, you can decide I don't want to trust Amazon, but given their retail experience, I think they know a thing or two. Um,
Sorry. Oh, yeah. Go ahead.
yeah. So I mean, the thing is, if you're just running a bit of a function, your your attack profile is tiny compared to spinning up a Linux box that's sitting behind a VPN, granted, but you know, uh, I mean, I don't know how you hack into a Lambda function.
That is a
So
huge aspect of lambdas I haven't heard anybody say before. There's very limited attack vectors. That's wonderful.
yeah, wow. Actually, I haven't heard anyone say that either. They're both safer and cheaper, and those are such incredible features that haven't even got the airtime yet. So yeah, it's cool stuff. All right, I'm going to try to pay attention to people's time limits because we are running just a skosh overtime. This might be the last slide. I'm not sure. Config rules. This actually ties in with what we were just saying. So suppose you have rules that ports need to be closed down on your instances, or that instances need to have specific tags. Well, you sort of rely on the good graces of your team to not create resources that break those rules. Or you can have these config rules that enforce all this. So it's not just security; it's cost savings. If you have resources that don't have tags, you don't necessarily know whether they're something you can turn off. Is that something that we forgot to turn off, or is it something that's so old that it didn't have a name and we better leave it running? Well, config rules lets you enforce that. The system comes with pre-configured rules that allow the thing to happen but send you notifications. But you can write your own rules, and lambdas, of course, that can block you or anyone else from creating these illegal, invalid resources in the first place. Again, you just keep hearing lambdas. So config rules look to be quite interesting. Yes, and that was it. That was it. So that's
What's back in Lambdas? Like, what is it running under? What's it, the operating system or the language? What's it written in?
lambdas are currently running on Linux instances. So there's no such thing as a so for instance, you can't write a PowerShell lambda yet. But they'll absolutely do that. No, in the Windows world, PowerShell is huge.
No, I mean, it sounds like there's going to be all kinds of. You can write it in whatever language you want. I'm saying is what is the Lambda itself running under? I'm just curious about. Did they even talk about that?
No.
Oh,
Never in your life will you find that out.
all proprietary, huh?
Yep. Yeah, there are certain things that Amazon is very good at information sharing, and there are certain things.
It's like the new Microsoft.
Well, what I found is if you ever want to find out what somebody is running on their stack, just look at their job advertisements and see what they're kind of looking for. That's usually a sign.
Ah, yes.
Point. Sounds like I'm going to be selling pencils on a street corner pretty soon. Not going to have anything to do.
Well,
Well, machine learning is going to learn how to program, and then we'll all be out.
Oh my God, I'm so excited. I've been hot and heavy on salt, man. Woo! And of course, someone's going to take that away from me. They took my salt.
Ryan, this is a really interesting presentation and recap.
thank you.
Very good. I wonder if people had any questions before I wrap up the recording. And then after I wrap up the recording, maybe people will have questions they don't want recorded.
Where was the show, in Vegas?
Yeah, at the Venetian.
Did the baby need a new pair of shoes?
I don't gamble.
You might as well just do this.
Right. In part just because it's smoky, but also just the show is it's crazy full. I mean, you're running from 7 in the morning. There are sessions from very early until very late, and then they have drinking parties every night. It's and you really have to pace yourself and not partake too much and drink a lot of water, because the next day you've got another 12 hours to fill your brain. So
was it a full week or just a couple days over the weekend?
It's Monday is pre-show for their big customers. Tuesday is what they call boot camps. 8-hour deep dive technical sessions, and then they have their big one of their big parties that night, and that's basically the party at the trade show floor, where there was, the trade show floor is about the size of a football field, just crazy, and I got my favorite shirt there that says "Data is the new bacon."
Mm-hmm.
And they pulled out all the stops. One booth had 2 full-size sumo wrestlers wrestling, and it was some metaphor about big data. I mean, I don't know.
Well, Brian, you've certainly filled our brains.
Oh my God, yeah! It's just crazy. I mean, I could only go to about. You can only actually go to about a keynote and then 4 talks in a day, and so I'm going to be watching videos for weeks. But
well, speaking of that, we'll conclude our video. I think people will be watching ours as well. Thank you very much to Brian Tarbox. Thank you to all our participants. Thought we had some interesting discussions.
Thank you.
We are Metro West Coders, still coding.